Hello everyone, I'm Elijah Roberson, and today I'll be talking to you about the Papal State. So if you look at a map of Italy, you see a leg with a high heel kicking an oddly shaped ball. And if you look closer at the map of Italy, you see multitudes of cities that sound like that one pasta you had to order at a restaurant once. And if you zoom in a little closer, you see San Marino. And if you get a microscope and you zoom really closely in on Rome, you see a weird country called Vatican City. Now, first off, why the heck does this country exist? Because, why hasn't Italy consumed it? Or, why is it called a city if it's supposed to be a country? Well, we will answer the first question here throughout, but for the second one and third one, the answers are wrath of God and bad country naming. So, to fully understand how the Vatican became so small, we got to go all the way back to the wonderful year of 754. A time where, as Archie and Edith Bunker sang, girls were girls and men were men. Men had names such as Aldwin and Egbert, and women had names such as Edwina and Frithguth. People were getting down to their favorite song with liturgical Celtic chant, and they were all reading, well, actually a few people read back then, so they weren't really reading books, but that's a different story. Before the foundation of the Catholic state, as we know today, Christians found themselves not allowed to really worship anywhere because the Roman Empire did not view Christianity as a real religion. So, they were too busy converting masses of populations to their religion and destroying pagan temples and stuff. So the Christians found themselves having to meet in back rooms and alleys to do their worshiping because it was illegal in the Roman Empire. Then this guy named Constantine came along, and he was like, hey, we killed your founder and a bunch of other Christians, so as an apology gift, we'll just kind of make your religion legal so you don't get mad at us and revolt or something. So they did that, and Constantine himself, the emperor, converted to Christianity, which meant that the Christians could pretty much worship in their own land, where they could build churches and temples on. In fact, Constantine himself made a huge grand temple for them in Rome. So after Constantine did all this, there was a bit of an issue, though. Because around this time, the Roman Empire wasn't exactly stable and, stuff. It already split off into two. But the Christians really didn't care. They were like, oh, we have Rome protecting us. Nothing will ever stop our Latin protectors. And then the Ostrogoths came in. And, yeah. So, the Ostrogoths came in, took over all of Italy, pretty much destroying the Western Roman Empire from the inside out, kind of like cutting the head off a huge monster. And so the Christians got so scared, they do what most people often do when they're afraid. They elected a pope. Yay. And that seemed to work, because the Ostrogoths just kind of left them alone, and they didn't really seem to care that the Christians were worshiping or anything, so they just kind of let them be. And then the Byzantines came back, who were the Eastern Roman Empire, and they came back to take Italy back under Roman rule so they could hopefully reform the Roman Empire. It proceeded to fail, and then the Lombards came in, and they took all of Italy, except for a small little band of land that they didn't take that the Byzantine Empire was able to hold on to. And since, the Byzantine Empire was too busy with internal affairs and trying to reform the Western Roman Empire, they pretty much told the Pope, hey, you want to just govern this small bit of land here because we're too busy? And the Pope was like, yeah, sure. And so he took over pretty much governing that land. And despite the fact that it was technically part of the Byzantine Empire, the Pope kind of acted on his own accord, and it was pretty much an independent country. In fact, at one point, he even excommunicated the emperor of the Byzantine Empire somehow. I don't know how, but he did. And so this what became known later on as the Duchy of Rome. And the Pope was now the ruler of his own territory, and oh boy, he was quite the guy. Everyone loved him so much that the Lombards, who owned most of Italy, literally declared his land an independent state. And the Byzantines didn't care. They were just like, yeah, all right, that's fair. And so they didn't say a word. And the Pope eventually grew his own army, and as a thank you to the Lombards for making him an independent nation, he pretty much just kicked them out of northern Italy. And that's when the Lombards collapsed. And then you had Italy split up into a bunch of different independent kingdoms. And then Charlemagne was like, hey, Pope, here, you have all those independent kingdoms, and those kingdoms, because they were all Christian, just were like, yeah, all right, we'll just let the Pope take over. We're not going to ask any questions. And so then you have what is now known today in history as the Papal State. Despite many, what you may picture the Pope as now, a big religious softy who wears a fish hat on his head, the popes in the medieval era were rather, not Christian. Most popes who ruled over the Papal State suffered from letting the power go to their head, and they ended up doing all sorts of bad things, like assassinating other people, committing tax fraud probably somewhere down the line, and a bunch of illicit things that I cannot talk about because they're really bad. But in the medieval world, the Pope was the most powerful person on earth. If you haven't already guessed, medieval people, didn't have a whole lot of scientific knowledge, and most of the stuff that happened, they somehow pinned to God. I'm not saying that was a bad thing they did. It was just, in most cases, it wasn't always the healthiest. So, for instance, if their house burned down, they would have been, instead of going, oh, I shouldn't have bought those new draperies and left them next to a candle, they would go, oh no, I must have sinned pretty badly if that happened. Or if their son died of the plague, they would have been like, oh, he must have just committed some really bad sin. And so the Pope, pretty much, imagine being the guy who is the messenger of God, and everyone just is like, listens to you like crazy. Even kings, the Pope had a lot of power back then. So he could stop kings from going to war, he could excommunicate whole countries, actually, and he could call crusades on any nation he really chose if he felt like it. So the Pope had a lot of power, and most of the cardinals didn't do a whole lot to stop him from having that power. So, everyone just the Pope pretty much ruled all of Europe at that time and any other Christian nation. So then a thing happened called the Renaissance, and people began to discover more about science and stuff and how things work, and they were much less inclined to just look to the Pope for religious ideas in power. Instead, they started thinking, more along the lines of, I did this and this happened, and they didn't just blame everything on religion. So the Pope Pope's power waned. Don't get me wrong, he still had a lot more power than he does now, but he didn't have it like he did back then. So then, after a few hundred years, around the 1700s, the Kingdom of Sardinia decided it was going to unite Italy under one banner. And to do so, it had to take out all these independent states that existed in Italy. There were a lot of them. And so they did that, except they let the Papal State alone, and they were like, hey, after they taken over most of Italy, they were like, hey, Pope, we're gonna, annex your land. Can you just, let us do that? And the Pope said no, and they showed up with cannons, and they forcefully invaded the Papal State, and none of the Christian nations really did anything, so the Pope freaked out, and he ran into a temple and locked himself in there for over 100 years. It wasn't the same Pope. They elected new ones, but pretty much what happened was the Pope and all his cardinals locked themselves in this big temple, and they went about their daily lives as normal, like a Papal State, only they only owned that one building. And what did the Kingdom of Italy do? Did they forcefully march in and kick the Pope out of there? Did they, say, hey, we'll let you keep governing if you let us have that temple? No, they just kind of let him go. They didn't care enough to do anything about it. So that's how, if you look at a map of Italy, the Papal State is now so small. In 1929, it officially became the Vatican City, because calling it the Papal State was a bit of a stretch, because it wasn't really a state and it was way too small for anyone to see it. So that small little dot on the map is what the Vatican City is today. Fortunately, the Pope is more Christian than he was 900 years ago, and the Catholic government is much less corrupt than it used to be. So now you know the history of the Pope ruling things. I did a thing.